Berserk is a story about fate repeating itself time and time again. Its main storyline and character relationships reflect what happened 1,000 years ago, when Supreme King Gaiseric set out to establish the Empire of Man and ended up causing the First Eclipse in the process. The circle is about to run all the way around with Guts and Griffith, and what makes things feel even more repetitive is the fact that we have a character from the First Eclipse alive during the last. That's right, if you still believe that Skull Knight isn't King Gaiseric, then you're living in denial, because all the clues are there in the manga. But in this video, we'll be discovering whether Skull Knight's spiritual successor Guts will end up like him, because there are hints that this might happen, and if it does, then it could change the entire landscape of the series. So, without further ado, let's get straight into it. Guts has been fighting the Inhumans for years, like Skull Knight. The first similarity between these two characters comes from the latter's first appearance, because by the time Skull Knight makes his debut in chapter 37, we already know that Guts will fight the Inhumans. The opening arc of Berserk establishes Guts' purpose as a borderline maniacal demon hunter who's on the path of vengeance and cleansing the world of impure presences as a byproduct. The Black Swordsman arc tells us at the very end that the God Hand member named Femto is the man formerly known as Griffith, who was Guts' inspiration and the reason he was marked with the brand of sacrifice. The Golden Age arc is all about catching up to that foundation by introducing characters that explain the reasons behind Guts' hatred for Griffith, and one of those reasons is Skull Knight. The first apostle Guts encounters, chronologically speaking, is Nosferatu Zod. He fights the Immortal One during a routine castle siege as part of Midland's war against the Tudor Empire, and it shakes his entire worldview about what's real and what isn't. This is also when Guts first realizes that Griffith's behelit might be an evil talisman more than a good luck charm, because the demon that attacked them stopped when he saw it hanging around his neck. From that point onward, Guts seems to notice every moment where this devil's luck plays out in front of his eyes, like Griffith surviving that poisoned arrow, or he himself getting a sword from out of nowhere when his regular weapon breaks at a critical moment. Guts gets all the signs that something larger than human ambition is afoot here, but because he's not a superstitious man, he doesn't put much stock into it. That changes the night he leaves the Band of the Falcon, because on that night, his worst fears are confirmed and his true nightmare begins. Despite knowing all the signs of a spiral were there, Guts leaves Griffith, choosing to trust in his steely determination and the fact that he wouldn't falter because of the loss of a single man. Guts idolized Griffith at this point, and he wanted to emulate his idol as best he could. That's the whole reason he leaves the Falcons, because he wants to find a dream of his own and return to Griffith as his equal. That means that he wouldn't allow anyone to stand in his way either, because that's what Griffith does, and though he knew that some weird stuff was going on with the behelit, Guts decides to do what Griffith would do anyways. He puts his dream ahead of his concerns, and that seems to fulfill a part of the prophecy of Griffith's rebirth, because it's on that very night that Skull Knight pays him a visit. He calls himself the foe of the Inhumans, someone who stands up against the abominable apostles and demon kind, and he identifies Guts as a fellow struggler. He calls Griffith Guts' unkingly other half, and claims that when Griffith falls from grace, a torrent of madness and death will pay Guts a visit. He informs Guts that his only chance at surviving the eclipse, which is name-dropped in front of another character for the first time, is to struggle, wriggle, and contend, and he walks away from the swordsman and wonders to himself whether Guts might actually pay heed to his words. He mutters to himself that only a man who stands with broken sword in hand within the abyss of despair can accomplish such an impossible task, and to absolutely no one's surprise, that's exactly what happens during the eclipse. While Guts fights off most of the eclipse apostles with a horn he breaks off of one of them, he does eventually pick up the sword of his fallen comrade Gaston and proceeds to break it, trying to free himself from Borkov, while Griffith had his way with Casca. Before the eclipse, Guts was like everyone else in that apostles terrified him. We saw just how scared he was for his own life when he battled Zod for the first time, and we later saw him psyching himself up multiple times during his fight with Wild, because he knew that if he gave into fear at such a critical moment, his chances of victory would go from being slim to none. He felt an immense sense of relief when he finally took Wild down, because he thought that this was the eclipse. But when the actual eclipse happened, and Guts had to witness his comrades being devoured by demonic entities, his inhibitions gave way to pure, unadulterated rage, and he went headfirst towards the apostles as opposed to running away from them or trying to survive. Guts' madness in that moment was partly responsible for keeping him alive, because in trying to kill entities much larger and stronger than himself, he relied on pure instinct to get him through. And so, when Skull Knight rescues him and sees that he has an actual broken sword in his hand, he thinks that his prophecy about Guts was as true as the prophecy of the Falcon, because this guy did manage to stand within the abyss of despair with broken sword in hand. Once Guts wakes up, Skull Knight informs him of his fate as a branded individual and gives him his own sword to fight off that first wave of dead spirits coming to possess Guts' body. And after they deal with the little problem of Casca birthing a demon baby, he gives Guts advice about how to achieve his heart's desire. He tells Guts that he can use his brand of sacrifice as a tracking system based on the pain it invokes, because the closer he gets to apostles, the worse it will bleed and hurt. He warns Guts that his path was going to be dark and that he was going to have to do some heinous stuff, but that he should always strive to not give into darkness, because there would be no saving him after that. Skull Knight's first 3 interactions with Guts mold his life for the next 2 years that follow the eclipse, because despite not knowing him or fully trusting him, Guts does exactly what Skull Knight advised him to do. He uses his brand of sacrifice to track and kill the same apostles that he was afraid of right before the eclipse. His rage and desire for revenge is stronger than his fear, so strong that it makes him override the natural fear response prey would have in front of predators whenever he faces an apostle, because that's what they are. Apostles are predatory beings whose primary prey is humanity, and though his reasons aren't exactly moralistic, Guts is working to cleanse this inhuman presence from the world. That's the same task that Skull Knight claims to be carrying out, and in fact, Guts is probably outperforming Skull Knight because he's a human being who can roam the physical world at all times. Skull Knight's apparition in the physical world seems contingent on the appearance of a full moon, because he's mostly showed up in the story on nights of the full moon. He also calls himself a wandering wraith, which implies that he's only a spirit that takes form under special circumstances. Skull Knight also says that his goal isn't noble because he too is driven by vengeance, and that's something we'll explore in a few moments because it ties these two characters together in a way that no one would have expected. But the point we're trying to make is this: Guts and Skull Knight walk the exact same path following the eclipse, and their goals are also exactly the same. We know from the Black Swordsman arc that Guts' arch nemesis is Femto, aka Griffith, and the reasons are elaborated upon during the eclipse. Likewise, Skull Knight's arch nemesis appears to be the leader of the God Hand, Void, whom he takes a shot at as soon as he breaches the eclipse in chapter 88 in a scene that mirrors Guts' first on-page meeting with Femto. Flora even wonders out loud whether Skull Knight is trying to recreate himself through Guts soon after her introduction, because she knew him as a human being and she's aware of the tragedy of his life. So Skull Knight and Guts are already tied together by the epithet struggler, because they're the ones struggling against the tide of fate with their eternal rage and magic swords. Skull Knight's sword might look more demonic than magical with all those thorns covering it, but it's clearly a magic sword because it cuts through apostles like butter, and it later gets coated in behelits, allowing it to cut through layers of the astral world. Guts' Dragon Slayer is flat out called an enchanted blade, without using those exact words, because the reason he doesn't take a magical weapon after reaching a witch's home is because he already has one. Dragon Slayer has cut through so many dead souls and possessed beings and apostles that their blood has tempered it and turned it into a demon killer, and that's exactly what guys like him and Skull Knight need. So the symbolic storytelling parallels were already present between Guts and Skull Knight ever since the latter was introduced to the story, but things became even more evident after the Conviction arc, because it's then that the first physical connection between them is made. He's the second man to use the Berserker armor after Skull Knight. Up until the beginning of the Millennium Falcon arc, the similarities between Guts and Skull Knight were mostly symbolic and narrative-based. Like Skull Knight, Guts goes on a quest to expel darkness from this world by making the Inhumans his foes. He heeds Skull Knight's advice and uses his brand of sacrifice as an apostle radar, and he holds disgust in his heart for what the God Hand did to him. There's also the fact that during the Conviction arc, Skull Knight literally calls Guts' current path a parallel to his own when he breaks down what the incarnation ceremony is supposed to be like. He repeatedly says all flows as if parallel to that time, which Guts thinks means Griffith's eclipse, but in Skull Knight's mind, it might be the eclipse that he personally experienced. And then there's the rivalry that Guts and the Immortal One develop over the years, which is almost identical to Zod's rivalry with Skull Knight. In chapter 80, Zod proclaims that there are none but Skull Knight who fulfill his criteria for being the absolute definition of strength, and ever since he first crossed swords with Guts, Zod has felt that this guy shows similar promise. It's quite telling that the first time we see Zod after the eclipse is when he's killing a bunch of inconsequential mercenaries and thinking about Skull Knight and Guts, because he ends up meeting both of them during and after the incarnation ceremony. His reunion with Guts in particular was thoroughly invigorating for him because he simply couldn't believe just how far this human had come as a warrior. Zod constantly compliments Guts' skill and ferocity during their battle on the Hill of Swords, not because he's trying reverse psychology on him, but because he genuinely respects the amount of work that's gone into honing Guts' swordplay. Zod knew that Guts had been going around the world killing apostles for a couple of years, and so he was completely aware of the kind of carnage he'd have to put himself through to get this good. That's praise he only reserves for Skull Knight usually, so it makes complete sense from a storytelling perspective that Zod is the one to realize the link between Guts and Skull Knight. Shortly after meeting a physical manifestation of Slan in the woods near Enoch Village, where the astral world's region of darkness has suddenly appeared, he returns to his temporary base at Flora's Spirit Tree mansion only to find it ablaze. Guts' brand of sacrifice immediately alerts him to the presence of apostles in his vicinity, but because he's just duked it out with their leader, he's more than a little injured and unable to fight like he usually does. Matters are made worse when an apostle the size of a giant steps forward to challenge Guts to a duel, because not only does he not have any armor on, he's also sporting astral wounds that reopen when he takes the first blow from Grunbeld. Grunbeld's sheer size, even in his human form, tells Guts that he needs something special to take this bastard down, and surprisingly enough, Flora already had something cooking in her basement for him. Just before Guts and his companions returned to her spirit tree, she was seen applying a talisman to a suit of armor she keeps in one of her tree storehouses, and Skull Knight was there as well. He took a look at what Flora was doing and thanked her, but also expressed his belief that fate was a circle if they had to break this particular weapon out. But Flora countered by saying that she believes fate is a spiral, and that the children of today aren't destined to make the same mistakes as she and Skull Knight did. Nonetheless, she admits that she didn't want to use this thing in their upcoming battles, but then the perspective zooms out to show us the Berserker armor for the first time. What's interesting about this armor is the fact that before Guts puts it on, its helmet is shaped like a skull, and it's only after he synchronizes with its ode that it takes on Guts' wolfish motif. It's heavily implied that this helmet was skull-shaped because Skull Knight used it before Guts, and that's pretty much confirmed by Zod when he sees what Guts is wearing to battle with Grunbeld. The Immortal One knowingly chuckles to himself and asks Skull Knight if he intends for Guts to take the same path to hell because he knows that the Berserker armor belonged to Skull Knight way back in the day. The Wandering Wraith doesn't respond to the Immortal One, or if he does, we aren't shown his response because we're meant to think that he answered yes. Zod claims that seeing Guts take on the Flame Dragon Grunbeld wearing his old armor must make Skull Knight nostalgic, which we think is true because he shows up not long after to warn Guts of its effects. After defeating Grunbeld and escaping Flora's burning mansion, Guts spends nearly a month recuperating, which means that the lunar cycle reaches its full moon stage by the time he gets moving again. That doesn't make Skull Knight's appearance in chapter 237 surprising, because by now we've figured out that he shows up on nights of the full moon. What does surprise us is how frank he's being with regards to his past and the information he has on the Berserker armor, because up until this point, he'd been extremely cryptic with his advice. Skull Knight had a pattern of presenting vague information to Guts that he relied on the swordsman to decode, and whenever he did give accurate information, he didn't bother to explain its technicalities to him. However, he opens his interaction with Guts in chapter 237 by rattling off all the side effects of using the Berserker armor, like losing sight and taste and developing a tremor that indicates you'll soon lose control over your body as well. Shirke, who by this point has become Guts' steadfast companion and magical advisor, calls out Skull Knight for being the previous owner of the Berserker armor, and he doesn't deny it. In fact, he does her one better and tells her that he and Flora were a lot like Shirke and Guts, and that they were friends bonded through the arcane knowledge of magic. When she greeted the Black Swordsman's party in her Spirit Tree mansion, Flora mentioned that she was warned of their arrival by a friend, and it's revealed shortly after that her friend was none other than Skull Knight. So Zod was right when he rhetorically asked Skull Knight if he intended for Guts to follow the same path he took to hell. He's basically forcing him to cosplay as himself, right down to using his former suit of armor and everything. Perhaps the biggest difference between them is the fact that Guts does seem to be doing things in reverse, because it doesn't make sense for Skull Knight to have gone through an eclipse before using the Berserker armor. There are several hints in the story that he actually used the Berserker armor to conquer the world, which caused his own sensory decline and led to him making the choices that led to the First Eclipse. The most significant hint comes all the way back from chapter 53, where we're given Skull Knight's backstory under his original human name. Up until Guts hears of Supreme King Gaiseric's epithets, he thinks that this guy sounds a lot like Griffith, but then he hears that Gaiseric went to battle wearing a skull helm, and that instantly makes him think of Skull Knight, which was our first clue that Gaiseric and Skull Knight are essentially one and the same. This idea is pretty much confirmed by the flashback from chapter 362, which explained to us Skull Knight's backstory in the most cryptic fashion fashion possible. But if you kept your eyes and your minds open while reading it, you'd have come to the same conclusion as Guts, that he and Skull Knight are essentially one and the same. Their stories are nearly identical with one major change. Chapter 362 shows us a blood memory that is seeped into the Berserker armor, and blood memories are created under unique circumstances. We're informed by the armor's creator, the dwarf blacksmith Hanar, that what Guts is about to witness are the memories of the final moments of the armor's previous owner, which means that they were the final moments of Skull Knight's human life. In the flashback, we see Skull Knight cutting through several demonic, hairy-looking tendrils that we think were proto-apostles, while the Abyss lingers in the backdrop. We then see a close-up of the Abyss and find Void standing at the head of an unholy group of deities in much the same way that Griffith took center stage in the Black Swordsman arc when the God Hand was first introduced. Gaiseric nearly leaps at Void as soon as he sees him, but he's held back by a vision of his dying lover, who we're told is the former ruler of Elfhelm. And then we see a giant brand of sacrifice spreading across Gaiseric's capital city, which is presumably what led to said city sinking into the earth and being sealed underneath the Tower of Rebirth. Chapter 53 showed us that the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth crosses into the astral world, where Gaiseric's destroyed capital, with all its original inhabitants, lies sleeping. And we also noticed that each of these inhabitants has a brand of sacrifice seared into their forehead. As soon as Guts snaps out of the vision, Skull Knight tells him that what he just saw was the end of a foolish king and the beginning of a wraith wandering through the endless night. And at the very beginning of the next chapter, we see Skull Knight visiting the mausoleum of the woman Guts glimpsed in his dreams. We're told that this woman, who is also known as the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms, was once the most powerful mage in all of Elfhelm. In fact, she was Flora's mistress, much like Flora is Shirke's mistress, which means that she was probably Elfhelm's leader 1,000 years ago. The fact that she left her home to go all the way to Midland and that she was in love with Gaiseric tells us that he allied with Elfhelm to conquer the rest of the world. That's because allying with Elfhelm explains why the histories felt as though Gaiseric rose up from nowhere and how he managed to unify all of humanity despite the substantial obstacles such a goal presents. It's stated quite clearly by the manga that Hanar made the Berserker armor for Gaiseric, and that explains why his enemies gave him nicknames like the Skull King and the King of Galloping Death. When Guts wears the armor, Serpico specifically compares him to a Viking Berserker, and Supreme King Gaiseric is implied to have been an ancient Viking. His name, Gaiseric, is a Germanic name inspired by the Vandal King Gaiseric, who brought Rome to its knees for a while, and the Germanic peoples all claim descent from the Vikings in some way. Also, we're told that Elfhelm was once invaded by a Viking army a long time ago, with their remnants being turned into the island's gigantic wicker men, and their weapons and armor being turned into paraphernalia for the training gnomes. So what we have here is a situation where Guts and Gaiseric have the same stories, being approached from opposing vantage points. In Gaiseric's story, he finds the mythical elves and fairies when he comes to Elfhelm, allies with them, gets the Berserker armor, conquers the world, and then damns it through his actions, which led to the First Eclipse. We don't want to go too deep into the details of that event in this video because we've already made a video about it, which you guys should definitely check out. But basically, Gaiseric, under the influence of the malign ode of the Berserker armor, ends up becoming a tyrant who tortures his outspoken friend Void to the point that the latter ends up becoming the first God Hand member. Gaiseric's friendship with Void when they were humans is implied through the fact that Void was able to brand Gaiseric's lover with the brand of sacrifice, which wouldn't have happened if he wasn't close to both the king and the queen. We've speculated in our videos on Void that Gaiseric and Void had a dynamic similar to Guts and Griffith's, except their roles were reversed. Gaiseric was the one who wanted to become king, whereas Void was the one who wanted to ostensibly work for the people. This is perhaps why Skull Knight refers to Griffith as Guts' unkingly half when he first meets him, because he knows that the path that Griffith is on mirrors his own in the worst way possible. That's also part of the reason why we think Guts' life is Gaiseric's in reverse, because Gaiseric's path ended with the eclipse, whereas Guts' story truly begins with Griffith's eclipse. He had no kingly ambitions, he was just looking for a place to call his home and love to heal his heart when he came across the Falcons. It was soon after he found both of those things that they were taken from him, which put him on the path of vengeance that he still pursues. Guts had to go through the eclipse to acquire the Berserker armor and then get to Elfhelm, which is basically Gaiseric's life trajectory in reverse. And if you still weren't convinced that these two characters are essentially becoming the same person, then you've already forgotten about that little mausoleum we mentioned just a few seconds ago. Right after he comes out of the blood memory, Guts is led to the final resting place of the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms, and as Skull Knight descends into the mausoleum to pay his respects, Guts and Shirke have a quick sidebar about his former lover. Apparently, she looks a lot like Danon, and there's even a moment between Skull Knight and Danon that suggests that they're vaguely aware of their former status as star-crossed lovers. Miura's art style in that moment is highly evocative of a romantic reunion, and the tragedy is apparent in the complete lack of recollection on Danon's part. If you're confused as to who this character is, Danon is the current leader of Elfhelm, who's a giant cherry blossom-colored elf who also happens to look a lot like Gaisric's lover. It's implied that she was brought back to life as an elf by Flora, who then got kicked out of Elfhelm for violating the taboo of reanimating the dead, which is a theory that deserves a video of its own, honestly. Even the parallels between Skull Knight and Guts' lovers goes beyond time and history, because while Skull Knight's lover was a mage and is now an elf, after Casca wakes up from the Quarter of Dreams, she also takes on distinctly elven symbolism. The first dress that Danon has Casca wear is a rather flowery dress that looks like it belongs to a princess. Danon herself was the princess of Elfhelm, and considering Casca is her spiritual successor as the main character's main squeeze, it makes sense why the Flower Storm monarch chooses to dress her like a princess. Even after she changes Casca's outfit into a hunting outfit upon her insistence, Danon calls her a dark elf princess, which just carries over her own symbolism from her human life and projects it onto Casca. After witnessing this rare moment of tenderness from his generally cryptic fellow struggler, Guts wonders out loud if he and Skull Knight are one and the same, and based on their individual stories, it appears as though they are. Both Guts and Skull Knight are formidable warriors and charismatic leaders who became unstoppable thanks to the Berserker armor. Both Guts and Skull Knight have vowed to bring down the God Hand and demonic entities as a vengeful quest instead of a noble one, and both Guts and Skull Knight lost the only things they'd ever loved to the heedless ambition of those they called friends. In fact, Guts' inner consciousness even thinks of Casca as being dead since the day of the eclipse, mostly because she's no longer the lively warrior woman she once used to be. But therein lies the biggest difference between their tales. Where Skull Knight experienced the eclipse at the end of his life, Guts experienced it at, let's call it the halfway point. And he has one thing that Skull Knight doesn't, which is his lover, who, though traumatized, is at least still alive in her original form. Skull Knight breaking into the site of the eclipse is a rather tragic rescue mission when you realize he was able to do for Guts what he couldn't do for himself. Yes, Casca was broken by her experience, and most likely in a way that can never be fully repaired, but she is alive, and that's thanks to Skull Knight, not Guts. He often claims that he does what he does for vengeance against the God Hand and nothing else, but Skull Knight actually has a history of helping damsels in distress. He obviously saw the Lady Priestess in Casca when he saved her and Guts from the eclipse, but he probably also saw her in Luca during the Conviction arc. Everyone's favorite sex worker was falling from the Tower of Conviction during Guts' confrontation with Father Mosgus and his pseudo-apostle angels, and she'd pretty much accepted death when Skull Knight swooped in on his horse and saved her. He also saved her after she was abducted by the egg of the perfect world, and on both occasions, he warns Luca to not get involved any further. But she still ends up going back to help her friends because that's just the kind of person she is. Skull Knight looks at her going back to the carnage and thinks she's either a fool or an extremely brave person, and it gives you the feeling that he's recalling someone from his past. Maybe when he met the Lady Priestess, she was under attack from someone and he actually had to save her. His valor impressed her enough to make her fall for him, and that would make the parallels between him and Guts even stronger. Although he'd known Casca for 3 years, Guts didn't quite fall for him until he literally risked his own life to save hers. It was during the night where he earned the nickname 100-Man Slayer that Guts realized he liked Casca, but he had to make that stand specifically because he wanted to protect her from their enemies. Then there's also that little incident where he contacts Flora about giving Guts a hand on his journey and even fights for her at the time of her death just to ease her passing. Skull Knight clearly isn't just a ghost in a coffin stuck in a cycle of vengeance. He's got feelings beyond that, faint as they might be, just like Guts. And although he isn't a king, Guts has shown that he commands such respect from his peers that even a royal prince like Roderick calls him boss on instinct. In his quieter moments, Guts does show the abilities that would be needed in a king because he's kind, steadfast, gentle, and really strong. But at the same time, there's a darkness within him that, at the risk of sounding like a broken machine, is also something he shares with Skull Knight. Ultimately, the Wandering Wraith regrets what he did in the past because he knows that his current situation is entirely his doing. It's not often you hear a monarch calling themselves foolish, because that requires the kind of reflection that even a commoner like Griffith couldn't muster up when he needed to most. To be fair to him, Skull Knight has had like 1,000 years to reflect on his acts, and we do have visual proof of his sins from the past. Like we've speculated in our videos on Void, the reason he looks like a flayed man with an exposed brain and sewed-up eyes is that that's how he looked when he became a God Hand member, and if that's true, then Skull Knight was responsible for putting his former friend into that position. In Guts' case, the roles are reversed, but even before he acquired the Berserker armor, Guts had been burned by the darkness. There's a moment in the manga which we can think of as the blackest act of Guts' soul when he, consumed by his lust and desire for vengeance, decides to force himself on a mentally disabled Casca. His beast of darkness, the manifestation of his most troublesome and malign inner thoughts, made him nearly assault and kill Casca, because then he'd be kicking a rock off his path to Griffith. It's possible that Gaiseric also saw Void as an obstacle to ruling how he wanted to rule, and he'd actually been the owner of the Berserker armor for a very long time by then. Guts nearly assaulted Casca when he didn't even know it was a thing, so what do you think would have happened if he had the Berserker armor without the presence of his companions? In a way, Guts' story unfolding in the opposite direction as Skull Knight's is helping him because it's showing him all the mistakes he needs to prevent himself from making in the future. And yes, Guts does have a future in Berserk because we already know how this story will end, kind of. Kentaro Miura always said that Berserk won't have an ambiguous, bittersweet ending. He was a guy who watched Star Wars to learn the art of storytelling, and if Guts is the Luke of this story, then he's on a hero's journey, and a hero's journey typically ends in victory and retirement. So if that's the direction that Berserk is headed towards, then what's the connection with the undead Skull Knight? Well, it's the fact that Guts doesn't need to remain a human being to win his war with Griffith. He can, in fact, become something else, and that something else is the reason we're making this video. Guts might just end up becoming a spiritual entity in the Kushan Stupa, just like Skull Knight. So far, we've discussed how, save for a couple of minor changes and one major change, Guts and Skull Knight's stories are one and the same. They're both feral berserker warriors with magical companions who fight against the Inhumans to release humanity from their grasp. They both have friends who betrayed them in the worst possible way, and they both have lovers who got caught up in the cycle of evil. Guts has been retracing Skull Knight's steps in reverse, so obviously the question now becomes, will he actually become like Skull Knight? Because that's really one of the only things separating them as characters at this point. Yes, it's true that Guts doesn't want to become king of the world, and that he actually might make it to the other side of the upcoming battle, whether it's in One Piece or not, but the parallels between his story and Skull Knight's tale simply can't be ignored. Guts and Skull Knight are one and the same in more ways than one, and so it's not inconceivable that Guts might end up becoming just like Skull Knight before everything is said and done. There's some heavy foreshadowing supporting all this that comes from, well, basically every time someone sees Guts do an inhuman thing and then question how he did it. There's also the tiny matter of both Flora and Zod, who know Skull Knight best, accusing him of making Guts follow the exact same path as himself. Zod even says that Skull Knight wants Guts to take the long detour to hell that he himself is on, which makes sense considering the fact that Skull Knight should have also been branded with the brand of sacrifice. The whole reason his conflict with Void began in the first place was because he wanted to get revenge on him for sacrificing everything and everyone he loved, and that would have included himself. Skull Knight was actually so angry about his lover's death that he pushed the Berserker armor to its limits and got himself killed by it. Though Guts didn't have it on him during the eclipse, we have to imagine that if he did, the result would have been exactly the same. It's implied many times that Skull Knight is actually just a set of bones somehow being kept alive by his armor, and that feels sort of evident when you realize Skull Knight isn't his canon name. That name would be the Knight of Skeleton, and this really pushes the whole undead zombie warrior trope to its absolute limit. The Berserker armor is said to physically eat into the body of its wearer the longer they stay synced with its malignant life force, and it's not hard to imagine that Skull Knight could have become a bag of bones by the time he was reanimated. And he was clearly reanimated because the dwarf blacksmith Hanar calls him a moving and talking coffin, and he says that he made Skull Knight's current armor himself. Anyone with two eyes can see the effect that the Berserker armor has had on his body. It gets lost in the artwork sometimes, considering the shift to Studio Gaga is actually quite recent by Berserk standards, but in Miura's final chapters, you can see how gaunt Guts has become. He looks almost malnourished, and he's losing control over his body rather quickly. He can't aim well anymore, he can't cut a fish in half accurately, he's just making do with the Berserker armor somehow, and he thinks that's another clue about how Guts and Skull Knight share fates. Guts thinks to himself that he still needs the Berserker armor to make do in this world because his own strength is deteriorating rapidly, but he's also aware of the rate at which he's losing control over his own body as well. Despite that, he's still determined to keep using the armor and risking his life because he feels he needs the power of rage and malice to get through to Griffith. This might mirror Skull Knight's outlook on the Berserker armor as well, because we know he kept using it long after he'd unified all mankind. In fact, we can pretty much blame the armor for how Gaiseric turned out because we've seen the debilitating effect it had on Guts' mind. And so, will all this culminate in a ritual where Guts sheds his mortal coil and becomes an undead warrior dedicated to the sole pursuit of vengeance? Well, it might, and the reason for that is right now, Guts is in the astral world. That's right, folks. The mystery of the Kushan Stupa, which has to be one of the best new locations introduced to the series under Kujimori, is the site of Guts' rebirth. But what will this rebirth actually look like? We've discussed this in another video where we spoke about the concept of the reverse eclipse, and you should go watch that if you haven't already, because it's honestly some of our best work, if I do say so myself. The fact that Guts was brought to the Stupa by Daiba specifically for the sole reason of addressing his inner conflicts and transcending his current spiritual crisis tells us that Guts is about to get a power-up of some kind. Throughout Berserk, the one thing that's been consistent with Guts' character is the fact that he doesn't really like to think a lot. Guts is a surprisingly poetic and reflective guy, but he's stubborn as hell, and his first instinct is to stick to his guns no matter how right the other person might be. And of late, whenever he's by himself, he has dark thoughts of killing Casca and doing all kinds of heinous things, which he doesn't want to have, but he can't deny are real at the same time. Guts is caught up in a knot where his desire to protect is tangled with his desire for revenge, because revenge is a desire that's honed in blood. But that same blood will rust the steel of your heart until nothing is left, and how can you ever protect someone else when you are nothing? It would have been a completely different matter if Guts emerged from the Stupa having regained his mental stability and figured out a way to keep himself in check while drawing on the Berserker armor's power, because that would have solved the problem that got Skull Knight stuck on Earth in the first place. It's more than likely that the reason he was even able to survive getting killed by the armor is because his life force merged with the armor's life force, which was then separated and stuffed into his current suit. We know that it's possible for something like this to happen. Every time we get Guts' viewpoint from within the armor, we can see that he's basically merging with it on a physical and spiritual level as the armor becomes an extension of him and its raging emotions amplify his own. So, if the merger happened because Skull Knight lost his top after seeing what Void did to his city and his girl, then it makes sense that he'd merge with the armor's ode instead of outright dying. It also explains Skull Knight's constant claims of being an entity born of revenge, because vengeance is the feeling that the Berserker armor amplifies the most. So, if Guts takes that out of the equation entirely, then there's no need for him to be worried anymore, and he can keep fighting as a living man. But the reason we think things won't exactly play out like that is simply because he was pulled into the astral world by a lotus leaf. The Kushan Stupa is a place where the highest of Kushan monks have gone to inter themselves in honor of the gods for thousands of years. At least that should be the case, seeing as Berserk's stupa is no different from Buddhist stupas. This makes the site sacred, and Daiba flat out tells Salat that the interior of the stupa is actually in the astral world. He says that the stupa's interior and exterior are divided by more than just walls. They exist in two different worlds, which means that Guts was already in the astral world before he started hyperventilating. When that happened, he fell onto the lotus leaf in the middle of a pool of water within the stupa, and after seeing blood blobs manifest on the ceiling, Guts is swallowed by the lotus leaf and pulled underwater. Now normally, this would mean that he's on his way to hell, because the stupa's interior feels like a trap and Daiba has been acting suspicious as of late. But the reason we don't think that's true is quite simple. Nothing about the stupa felt like a demonic ritual, and demonic rituals need trigger mechanisms, most notably Behelit's. Guts doesn't have a Behelit on him anymore. The Kushan confiscated it when they threw him in jail, so there's a low chance of the lotus devouring being related to a demonic ritual. But there is a good chance that it turns Guts into a warrior of the idea of good, and it's possible that to become that warrior, he'll have to sacrifice his physical body. There is a precedent for this in the story, because upon her death, Flora didn't actually die. She became a fiery spirit who looked more like she did in her youth, and she helped Guts and company escape Griffith's apostles with a wall of flames that even the dragon apostle Grunbeld couldn't breach. She also helped Shirke and Farnese navigate their way to the last fragment of Casca's shattered sanity within the Corridor of Dreams, which means that Flora can still be invoked as a fire spirit if someone knows the right spell for it. Flora has become what the story calls a daemon, and it's quite interesting that we're told daemons are made from the souls of dead mages, but also powerful warriors and heroes. Guts might not like to call himself one, but he's undoubtedly the hero of Berserk. His slaughter of the apostles alone is akin to a mythical knightly quest, albeit his motivations aren't quite as pure. Unlike a hero from folklore, Guts is a human being, and his humanity informs most of his decisions, even the ugly ones. And it's humans that gave birth to the idea of evil in the first place, which led to the creation of the God Hand and literally every single evil thing in this universe. So wouldn't it make a lot more sense for something that wasn't human to save humanity? Guts has many parallels to Odin, not just through his character's appearance, but also through his Viking symbolism. We know that the most famous story about Odin is the one where he stabs himself with his spear and hangs himself from the World Tree for 9 days, gaining access to the magical power of the rune. runes. This power is so immense that the perception of Odin changes entirely after he acquires the runes and becomes one of the strongest shamans in the world. Odin's riding of the World Tree is a death and rebirth event, and upon his return to the land of the living, he gains astral powers. So is it possible that the one-eyed Black Wolf Guts will find the runes at the bottom of wherever the Leaf submarine is taking him? The answer is yes, and it's also possible that this reality will give him the knowledge of how to undo the brand of sacrifice as well. Recall that when Flora first gives Guts and Casca their talismans, she specifically says that she doesn't have the strength to remove them from their bodies entirely anymore, which means that at her peak, she might have been able to do that. The brand of sacrifice involves a person's flesh and blood and soul, so maybe if you disconnect these things, it's possible to save at least one of them from going to hell. Spirits in Berserk are basically the souls of natured deities taking physical form, so there's a possibility that something like that will happen to Guts too. But the one thing that will be completely different about him and Skull Knight when everything wraps up, whether Guts becomes a spirit warrior or not, is the fact that their stories won't end the same way. Skull Knight's story has already ended. His time as Skull Knight is a ridiculously long and painful epilogue that he himself is insisting on writing. No one asked Skull Knight to keep wandering through the night, bound to his armor and hunting demons until he can fill the hole in his heart. That was his choice, and everyone who cares for him or depends on him has been dead for 1,000 years. Now, even Flora and Hanar are gone, and when Skull Knight dies, he will be utterly alone. That doesn't have to be the case for Guts though, because if Miura really wanted to give him a hero's journey ending, then Guts just needs to find the one thing he's never had all throughout Berserk. He needs to have a family, and that can be had whether he's a human being or a spirit, seeing as we already have another character who has a spirit for a parent. The fact that Yzma never knew her mom doesn't stop her from recognizing her mom the moment she spots her, and while Guts can't really tell the Moonlight Boy is his son yet, he'll figure that out eventually. His test of morality in that moment will be to ask himself if revenge is more important than family, and we think that this time he might just say no, especially because he'll have gone through this entire death and rebirth process at the stupa, which will unlock his Odin-like power of the runes, which can only happen if Guts becomes an astral entity, at least on some level. So, to make a very long story short, yes, Guts will become Skull Knight by the time Berserk comes to an end. He already has become a lot like Skull Knight as their journeys have unfolded on parallel paths, but Guts won't step into Skull Knight's skin and live the exact same life as him because he might end up becoming a spirit as well, but there's a chance he won't be motivated entirely by revenge anymore. That alone is enough to set them worlds apart from one another, and so while we do want to see Guts rocking a cool undead armor as a semi-dead warrior, if it comes at the cost of changing Miura's vision for the ending of his story, then we don't want to see it. If it doesn't, then by all means give us Guts the Wolf Skull tomorrow please, because we know that when he returns he won't be the same man anymore. Otherwise, the entire story might as well stop publication right now because anything else would defeat the purpose of storytelling. Every piece of dialogue and character progress has culminated in this moment where Guts has to choose the madness within him instead of letting it run amok. Daiba told Salat in chapter 383 that he's waiting for whatever emerges from the stupa once Guts has finished gazing inward, and we warrant he's doing that because he's already seen that Guts will be important to cleansing the world from the God Hand's influence. So will Guts become Skull Knight? Yes and no, and yes and no, and yes and no. We'll have to wait and see exactly what form he'll take, but for the most part, it won't be as simple as putting him in a skull helmet and handing him an awesome flying horse. Marvelous verdict! But as for us, that's all we have for you guys on this topic, so let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you think Guts will become Skull Knight, or do you think he'll become something else entirely? Like, share, and subscribe to Marvelous Anime for more Berserk content like this, and we'll see you guys real soon. Until then, stay safe, and remember to keep on struggling, strugglers.